නව ඩොමෙක්ස් පැල්ලම් සහ විසබීජ අවම කර දින 3ක් දක්වා ටොයිලට් එක ෆ්‍රෙෂ්ව තමයි. ඩොමෙක්ස්.
The Go Home campaign. Despite the Galle Face Green protest continues for the 15th straight day, Prime Minister Rajapaksa rejects demands for an all-party government. If there is an all-party government, he says it will be under his leadership. Suspended debt. 3 international firms seek role on financial advice with creditors for $12 billion Sri Lanka debt revamp. Treat all equally. China must be treated just like any other creditor. Once talks begin to restructure Sri Lanka's debt, India tells IMF and World Bank. No to digital islands. EU passes historic law to hold social media sites accountable for illegal content and measures to thwart disinformation. All this and much more coming up on this Saturday, the 23rd of April, 2022.
100ක් දක්වා ඉස්සොරින් නැති 100ක් සුසිනිඳු කෙස් කලමක් ලබා දෙයි. Dove Anti-Dandruff.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
And a warm welcome joining you on First at Night tonight. I'm Indivari Amwat, taking you to your top stories. China must be treated just like any other creditor once talks begin to restructure Sri Lanka's debt, India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said today as she told the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. In an interview in Washington, Sitharaman has said all creditors must be treated equally and with transparency, as I have emphasized that point in general and in the context of Sri Lanka, unquote. Sitharaman said she has also requested the IMF to consider rapid aid for middle-income classified Sri Lanka, typically given only to low-income countries, as the pandemic has destroyed the island's tourism revenue. With foreign exchange earnings plunging, Sri Lanka struggled to manage its external debt, which had grown in part due to loans from China to fund ambitious infrastructure projects. Sri Lanka had about $3.5 billion in debt from China by end 2020, excluding loans to state enterprises. This year, it also has to pay $2.2 billion of principal and interest payments for dollar-denominated bonds and loans, with the number raising to about $2.7 billion annually in both 2023 and 2024. Available data compiled by Bloomberg showed. Now, 3 leading international firms are among firms seeking to provide financial advice for the $12 billion Sri Lanka external debt revamp. Reuters reported 2 New York-based and 1 London-based global financial services firms focused on investment banking advisory services are seeking a role with Sri Lankan creditors, as some bank holders and bondholders are weighing their options after Sri Lanka suspended external debt payments 10 days ago.
According to Reuters,
Kavindu.
Iris International Management LLP, Decision Boundaries LLC and Parallel Wellbeing LP are among firms seeking to provide financial advice to Sri Lanka's creditors as the island heads towards a revamp of its $12 billion of external debt. Some bondholders are weighing their options after Sri Lanka unilaterally suspended external debt payments 10 days ago. Reuters quoted 4 sources familiar with the situation as saying, Reuters reported asset managers BlackRock Incorporated and Ashmore Group PLC among the creditors organizing in a group ahead of talks and have hired law firms White & Case for advice. Recent filings show major asset managers such as Fidelity, T. Rowe Price and TIAA also hold some of the country's outstanding dollar bonds. Reuters quoted a creditor from a group saying the creditor group hasn't decided which financial advisor to hire. Another source close to the situation has said it was not yet clear on whether the group would hire one at all. Reuters reported that Sri Lanka's 2025, 2026 and 2027 bonds are all trading at distressed levels of just over 40 cents, close to all-time low hit in early March. The premium demanded by investors to hold the country's debt over safe haven US Treasuries has widened to 3,228 basis points, the highest since mid-March. The JP Morgan MB Global Diversified Index showed.
Finance Minister President's Counsel Ali Sabri said that the World Bank has agreed to release $300 to $600 million to Sri Lanka to ensure that people in the poverty-stricken areas are met with essential needs. The sum is expected to follow into the country and flow into the country in the near future. Speaking at a webinar organized by the Media Center for National Development yesterday, he also said that India agreed to provide another $500 million credit line to purchase fuel and also requested another $1 billion credit line to purchase essential goods for Sri Lanka.
අපි ලෝක බැංකුවත් එක්ක සාකච්ඡා කරා. ඔවුන් අපිට එකඟ වෙලා තියෙනවා ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් මිලියන 300ක් 600ක් අතර ලංකාවට නිකුත් කිරීම සඳහා එය ඍජුව පීඩිත පන්තියේ විශේෂයෙන්ම දරිද්‍රතාවයෙන් පෙළෙන සහ වඩාම පීඩාවට පත්වෙච්ච ජනතාව වෙත සහන ලබා දීම සඳහා විශේෂයෙන්ම සෞඛ්‍ය සහන බෙහෙත් ඊට ඇරුණාම ඔවුන්ට යම්කිසි ප්‍රමාණයකින් මුදල් ආධාර කළ හැකිද කැම බීම සහ ෆර්ටිලයිසර් සඳහා අපි සාකච්ඡා කරගෙන ඉන්නවා. අපි නිල මට්ටමින් ඉන්දියාවේ ගරු මුදල් අමාත්‍යතුමිය සමග සාකච්ඡාවේදී ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් මිලියන 500ක් දක්වා වූ ඉන්ධන මිලදී ගැනීම සඳහා යම්කිසි පහසුකමක් සලසා දීමට උත්සාහ තියෙනවා. ඒ අරුණාම දැනට බිලියනයක් සඳහා අපිට අනිකුත් අත්‍යවශ්‍ය ආහාර ද්‍රව්‍ය ඇතුළු භාණ්ඩ ආනයනය කිරීම සඳහා ඉල්ලීමක් කරලා තියෙනවා. එය තවදුරටත් ඒක ඉවර වුණාම තවත් බිලියනයක් ලබා දීම සඳහා අපි කරන ඉල්ලීමත් ඔවුන් ඉතාමත් හොඳින් සලකාගෙන යනවා. මම හිතනවා ඔවුන් ඒක ලබා දෙනවා කියලා. ඔක්කොටම වැඩි අපිට වැදගත්ම දේ තමයි ඒෂියන් ක්ලියරින් යුනියන් හැම මාස දෙකකට පස්සෙම ලංකාව කලාපයෙන් ගන්න LC වලට අදාළ මුදල් නැවත ගෙවීම සඳහා කාලය අවශ්‍යයි. එය දැනටමත් අපිට ගෙවන්න තියෙනවා ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් 1.4 බිලියන් විතර. ඒ සඳහා ජනවාරි මාසයේ දක්වා කාලය ලබා දීම සඳහා ඉන්දියාව මාස දෙකෙන් දෙකට උදව් කරනවා කියලා අපිට යම්කිසි නිල මට්ටමින් පොරොන්දුවක් වෙලා තියෙනවා.
Speaking further, Finance Minister Sabri explained expected support from China to tackle the ongoing economic crisis.
But they have announced, has already been announced, Chinese currency kind of a support, 200 million. So that will come immediately and rapidly. We are also negotiating with them some sort of a cash infusion and a further facility that is in serious stages. Hopefully that will work out. We haven't in detail started talking to them as far as the debt restructuring is concerned. What is important as far as debt restructuring is concerned, a lot of people are asking is there has to be transparency, uniformity, and no preferential treatment. So we need to talk to all of them, and I'm sure they will understand. Particularly, we should not be too pessimistic and give hopelessness to the public, because if that is the case, India is not going to put so much of money. So that means more than our people, they must be confident that Sri Lanka will pull through. Of course, it's going to get worse before it gets better. But if you work hard, if you be realistic, if you learn lessons from what India went through in early 90s and South Korea went through and what Thailand went through, South Malaysia went through, I'm very confident, even though it's going to be a painful few years, we can come back and come back strongly by getting proper structural reforms which is required for us to become a strong nation which need not to go back to IMF ever.
Now, former Prime Minister and leader of the United National Party, Ranil Wickremesinghe, says at least 175 members from all political parties with a common aim of ushering in economic development to the country must come together if Sri Lanka is to come out of the current predicament. Addressing a bankers' conference, he said that Sri Lanka once lost the chance to reach out to the IMF as its conditions were breached following the tax reduction implemented by this government.
හැම අවස්ථාවකම අපිට ආර්ථික ප්‍රශ්නයක් විදිහට ලෝකෙ හොඳට පියාගන්න. ලෝකෙ දියුණුවක් තිබුණා. ඉතින් අපිට ඒකට එළිලා යන්න තිබුණා. මේ සැරේ එහෙම නෙවෙයි. අපිට තාම අපේ ප්‍රශ්න තියෙන්නේ. ලෝකෙ වෙන ප්‍රශ්න නැපෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඒකත් අපිට ඉන්න යනවා. විශේෂයෙන්ම ඉන්ධන මිල ලෝකෙ වැඩි වෙන්න යනවා. අපි දැන්නම දැකලා තියෙනවා. ඒකට අපිට තියෙන ඉන්ධන මිල වැඩි වෙනවා. අපිට ඩොලර් නැහැ. ඩොලර් තිබුණත් ගායන්න පුළුවන් ඉන්ධන මිල අඩු වෙලා තියෙනවා. දැන් ප්‍රශ්නේ තියෙන්නේ අපිට යන කන්නේටවත් පුළුවන් වෙන්නේ කියලා කෝඩ ගේන්න. ඊළඟ සති දෙකේ තුනේදී යොදවන්න නැත්තම් යන කන්නේ ඉවර. මේ ගමන සම්පූර්ණයෙන් ඉවර රට නැති වෙනවා. ආර්ථිකය නැති වෙනවා. ඉතින් මෙන්න මේවට අපි කොහොමද මුහුණ දෙන්නේ කියලා වැඩසටහනක් ඇති කරගන්න ඕනේ. මේ වැඩසටහන තාම ඇති වෙලා නැහැ. ඒකත් මම කියුවා පාර්ලිමේන්තුවේ දැන් ආණ්ඩුවේ අස්ථාවරභාවයක් තියෙන අලුත් ආණ්ඩුව හදනවා 113ක් තියාගෙන මේව විසඳන්න බෑ. එහෙනම් මේ ආර්ථිකය ගැන හිතලා ඒ ගමන යන්න පුළුවන්, ඒ ගමන යන්න ඕන කියලා. හැම පැත්තෙම මන්ත්‍රී 175ක් තිබුණත් ඉදිරියට යන්න පුතද මේක අමාරු ගමනක්. කවුද මේ වගකීම බාර අරගන්නේ? මොකද අමාරු තීරණ ගන්න තියෙනවා. ජනප්‍රියභාවයෙන් මේක කරන්න බෑ. තිත්ත ඇත්ත කියලා යන්න තියෙනවා. අනික මම අහන්නේ මේක අපි ගොඩ අරගත්තා. ඊළඟ අවුරුදු 5 වෙනස් කරොත් මොකක්ද වෙන්නේ?
The Criminal Investigations Department informed the Kegalle magistrate that the 28-year-old suspect caught on video camera attempting to allegedly set fire to a fuel bowser during the Ramakan protest was arrested. According to police, the person in question has over 30 court cases filed against him for his involvement in illegal liquor operations. In the meantime, the final rites of the 41-year-old victim who was shot dead in police fire during the protest in Tuesday's protest in Ramakan was held today.
The protest at Ramakan was a day of tragedy when one protester was shot dead while several others had sustained injuries after police opened fire on the group in protest when they disregarded to disperse. 41-year-old Chaminda Lakshan succumbed to gunshot injuries. His remains were brought to his residence in Ramakan last morning. Meanwhile, leader of the United National Party Ranil Wickremesinghe and other members of the party arrived at the residence to pay their last respects. Meanwhile, close to 100 Buddhist monks, including Venerable Dr. Omalpe Sobiththera, visited the residence where Chaminda Lakshan's remains were laid to carry out religious activities. Later, his remains were buried at the family cemetery at Hirivadduna in Ramakan today. In the meantime, there were many protests worked off in the area of Ramakan against the death of the 41-year-old Chaminda Lakshan. In other developments, the Criminal Investigation Department arrested a 28-year-old last night who was seen trying to set fire to a fuel bowser during protests that escalated in Ramakan on Tuesday, the 19th of April. The police stated that there were more than 30 cases filed against the individual for his involvement in illegal liquor operations carried out in the area. However, the 28-year-old suspect was released on 2 surety bails, each valued at 100,000 rupees, after he was produced before the Kegalle Magistrates Court today.
The protest at Galle Face Green continued for a 15th straight day today. This is the 15th day since people gathered in protest of the executive and the current government amid shortages of fuel, domestic gas and a rising cost of living.
The determination of the people gathered at the Galle Face Green under the Go Home Gota protest has persisted for 15 days straight. Protesters gathering in front of the Galle Face Green stretch and in front of the Presidential Secretariat have had only one demand, and that is for the current government and the President to hand over the leadership of the country to more capable hands. There is no difference in the number of people and the will of the people who showed up at the Galle Face Green today as well. Many of the protesters continue to camp overnight at the protest site. Joining the protest efforts today were artists and a group of differently abled individuals who engaged in a protest march. Meanwhile, leaders of various trade unions had joined the protest last night. In the meantime, a memorial service was also carried out last night in memory of former rugby player Wasim Tajuddin. As the protest continues, some of the biggest corporates in Sri Lanka have called on the government to resolve the economic situation and bring stability to the country as soon as possible, and urged leaders to heed the voices of the people and set the country on a corruption-free path. In the meantime, protests were worked off in the areas of Ambalangoda, Galle and Badulla, urging the government to resign as soon as possible.
And we take a short commercial break. We'll be back soon.
Big 3.
During a telephone conversation with Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang assured his country's support to Sri Lanka to facilitate greater stability in economic and social development. In the meantime, 7 independent parliamentarians met the Chinese envoy in Sri Lanka and requested continued support to the country during this time of economic crisis. In response to the calls made by parliamentarians for an interim government, Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa meanwhile said in a separate interview that his consent is needed to the formation of any interim government. While expressing views in a radio interview, he once again invited the protesters at the Galle Face Green to discuss with him and to find solutions to the ongoing economic crisis.
7 out of the 41 parliamentarians who decided to remain independent in the parliament called on Chinese ambassador to Sri Lanka, Chi Cheng-hong, yesterday. The parliamentarians included Udaya Gammampila, Vasudeva Nanayakkara, Venerable Athuraliya Ratanathera and Dayasiri Jayasekara. During discussions, the Chinese envoy and the Sri Lankan parliamentarians have exchanged opinions on the current situation of the island nation and assistance provided by China. The parliamentarians had also sought China's continuous support for Sri Lanka. In the meantime, in a letter directed to President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, former Minister Dallas Alahappirama called for the establishment of an all-party government. Alahappirama noted that a small cabinet of ministers with the representation of all political parties in parliament needs to be appointed for a period of at least 1 year. He stressed that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet of Ministers should step down from their respective portfolios to pave way for an all-party government. In this backdrop, Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa says that the formation of any interim government should have his consent. Speaking during a radio interview, the Premier said that no one is willing to work with any other Prime Minister or even Ranil Wickremesinghe, and if there is an all-party government, it will be under his leadership and the Premiership. Prime Minister Rajapaksa once again invited the protesters at the Galle Face Green who are calling the government to resign to discuss with him to find solution to get out of the ongoing crisis.
President Gotabaya Rajapaksa says improving water-related infrastructure, including clean water supply and sanitation for all Sri Lankans by 2025 is a national target of the government. Addressing the 4th Asia-Pacific Water Summit virtually, President Rajapaksa said that Sri Lanka welcomes investments towards sustainability as well as broader development assistance for debt restructuring for a better economic recovery.
The 4th Asia-Pacific Water Summit commenced in the city of Kumamoto in Japan under the theme Water for Sustainable Development and Best Practices and the Next Generation. Addressing the summit, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa highlighted the commitment of the government to provide a clean water supply to the members of the public.
Protecting the sustainability and resilience of our water systems is a priority for us. Our discouraging the overuse of chemical fertilizers, pesticides and weedicides in favor of a more organic and sustainable agriculture was based in part on this requirement. So too is our national program to clean over 100 rivers and reduce riverbank erosion, prevent sand mining, illegal construction and discharge of effluents and plastic waste into our waterways. Significantly improving water-related infrastructure, including clean water supply and sanitation for all by 2025 remains a national target. We are continually improving capacity and quality of existing water supply schemes and initiating new ones to cater to areas with poor coverage. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, my government was able to increase the number of new water connections to the public by more than 50% compared to what had been achieved annually in previous years. Several projects intended towards improving water cycle management were also undertaken. These achievements reflect the emphasis we give to inclusivity and to fostering participatory growth to all Sri Lankans, which is at the heart of my government's development effort. Sri Lanka welcomes investments, technology transfers, and financing for our sustainability efforts, as well as broader development assistance and cooperation for debt restructuring to support our economic recovery during this critical time.
The Bar Association of Sri Lanka included 13 proposals today on what they believe could restore both economic and political stability in the country. BSL stated that the overreaching requirement at the moment is for the creation of a stable government with the ability to implement reforms domestically, with the ability and credibility to negotiate with the IMF, other multilateral agencies and friendly countries to help Sri Lanka get out of the economic crisis. The Bar Association issued a set of proposals today in order to restore political and economic stability in the country. The Bar stressed that without political stability, it would be virtually impossible to resolve the economic crisis. As such, among the 13 proposals, it stated that all actions must be consistent with the Constitution and the relevant legal instruments and transparency. The BASL proposes that the government immediately introduce the 21st Amendment to the Constitution by repealing the provisions of the 20th Amendment and restoring the 19th Amendment. They state that in addition to the provisions of the 19th Amendment, the 21st Amendment should stipulate that the appointments of the Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka and the Monetary Board should also be done with the approval of the Constitutional Council. Meanwhile, appointments of the secretaries to ministries, governors, ambassadors and heads of mission to be done on the advice of the Prime Minister in consultation with the Cabinet of Ministers. Further, presidential pardons should be done in accordance with recommendations by a body established by law appointed by the President on the recommendation of the Constitutional Council. It is also proposed that upon enactment of the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, all secretaries to ministries be appointed and all independent commissions other than the Judicial Service Commission be reconstituted. Meanwhile, they also state that the President should not hold any portfolios as it has been stipulated by the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. The Cabinet of National Unity shall prepare a common minimum program in consultation with the Advisory Council. The CMP will be tabled in Parliament for its approval, and implementation of the CMP will be the responsibility of the Cabinet of National Unity. In the meantime, the Common National Programme shall include the abolition of the executive presidency, while a budget presented by the interim government will be based on the CMP. The Sri Lanka Muslim Congress today stripped Minister of Environment Nazir Ahmed of his party membership. The decision was taken at a meeting of the party that convened yesterday. Minister Ahmed was sworn in to the ministerial portfolio of environment on the 18th of April, along with 16 other new cabinet ministers. He also endorsed the 20th Amendment to the Constitution earlier and voted in favour of Budget 2022 as well. The European Union approved new legislation that would pressure large online platforms to enforce illegal content on their platforms for potentially risk-paying billions in fines. Google's holding company Alphabet, Facebook holding company Meta, and other large online platforms will now have to do more to tackle illegal content or risk hefty fines under the new Digital Services Act. The new EU law will impact popular user-generated content platforms, including Meta-owned sites, Facebook and Instagram, as well as Twitter, TikTok and YouTube. It also comes as lawmakers in the United States are still grappling with how to make big tech companies do better with curbing harmful content.
After some 16 hours of negotiations, European Union countries and EU lawmakers reached a landmark law early on Saturday in Brussels, requiring companies to more aggressively police their content and take down anything deemed harmful or illegal quickly. The Digital Services Act is the second prong of EU antitrust chief Margaret Vestager's strategy to rein in Google's holding company Alphabet and Facebook's holding company Meta and other US tech giants. Last month, she won the backing from the 27-country bloc and lawmakers for landmark rules called the Digital Markets Act that could force Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta and Microsoft to change their core business practices in Europe. EU antitrust chief Margaret Vestager tweeted, "The Digital Services Act will make sure that what is illegal offline is also seen and dealt with as illegal online, not as a slogan, as reality." Under the DSA, the companies face fines up to 6% of their global turnover for violating the rules, while repeated breaches could see them banned for doing business in the EU. The new rules ban targeted advertising aimed at children or based on sensitive data such as religion, gender, race, and political opinions. Dark patterns, which are tactics that mislead people into giving personal data to companies online, will also be prohibited. EU lawmaker Dita Charanzova, who had called for such rules 8 years earlier, welcomed the agreement, saying Europe has made clear that Google, Meta, and other large online platforms cannot act as independent digital islands. Very large online platforms and online search engines will be required to take specific measures during a crisis. The move was triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the related disinformation. EU President Ursula von der Leyen tweeted, "Our new rules will protect users online, ensure freedom of expression and opportunities for businesses." The companies could be forced to hand over data related to their algorithms to regulators and researchers. The companies also face a yearly fee up to 0.05% of worldwide annual revenue to cover the costs of monitoring their compliance. Former US Secretary of State and Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton encouraged the EU to get a deal done and tweeted Thursday that for far too long, tech platforms have amplified disinformation and extremism with no accountability.
And that wraps up tonight's edition of First at 9, your primetime AdaDerana English News Bulletin. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.